New tonight, keeping that discussion open. This week, O'Connor Brewing Company in Virginia, NORML, will be hosting forums and panels to talk about marijuana.
Organizers say the discussions are meant to be educational and spark conversations. Chenue Her has more.
The events this week at O'Connor Brewing will revolve around marijuana and many different topics within that discussion, like the law and reform. Organizers say they want people on both sides of the discussion to come to the events so they can talk about it.
It's a discussion Jarrell Williams is passionate about.
Medical marijuana, recreational marijuana for me is a big deal.
Which is why when Virginia NORML and O'Connor Brewing Company partnered to host a legalized Virginia festival in Norfolk, he got involved.
Yeah, educational, it's a push for reform, it's a push to get those who are in charge of the laws to kind of pay attention and say, people of Virginia want this to happen.
All week, events will take place at the brewery with speakers to elevate the discussion on marijuana and policy reform. The forums will be talking about how a city can be more progressive to race and marijuana.
People of color are jailed more so than those who are white or fair skinned, even though we equally use marijuana, statistically proven.
We're really going to cover what has happened in the past as far as how African Americans specifically have been impacted by the war on drugs.
Sarah Kaya Morton volunteers with NORML and will serve as a moderator for one of the forums. She encourages even those who aren't in support of legalizing to come out and engage.
Those people who don't support it right now may not support it for a variety of reasons.
Open conversation, people being open to have different viewpoints. I want to hear debates, healthy debates, and I want people to walk away that they learned something.
In Norfolk, Chenue Her, 13 News Now.